Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Faith Roundtable, hosted by yours truly, Josh Burtram. Today I'm excited to sit down with Dr. Benjamin Shaw, who is the president of Core Apologetics and adjunct professor of theology. We're going to explore his new book, Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. If you've ever wondered about the New Testament and its reliability, or even the Bible in general, and you want solid answers to strengthen your faith or just pique your curiosity, this episode is for you. We've made it easy for you to check things out that you like throughout just using the chapters. But make sure, please, that you hit like and subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. And now, without further ado, let's get into this episode that's going to strengthen your faith and deepen your understanding of the New Testament. Well, hi there, Josh Burtram here, your faithful host on the Faithful Politics podcast and your host here on the Faith Roundtable. I'm excited to have another episode to bring to all of you. And today I get the distinct privilege of interviewing Dr. Benjamin C.F. Shaw. Ben is the president of Core Apologetics. He also serves as an adjunct professor of theology at Liberty University and an affiliate faculty member of Colorado Christian University. He has worked with Dr. Gary Habermas for over a decade to collaborate in philosophical, historical, and theological research and publishing. Ben, is it okay if I call you Ben?
Please call me Ben. Please call me Ben.
I figured as much because in the emails you had Ben on there. I would have gone with Benjamin, but it's so great to have you on the program with us today. Thanks for being here.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to talking about this great topic, and I'm just glad you guys asked me to come on, and I'm excited to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're going to be interviewing you today about your latest book, Trustworthy, 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. And I love that. But, since you're a little bit new probably to our audience and they might not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about your background and your journey into apologetics and even this core apologetics. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'll try to give you guys the very shortened version, but I got saved at a young age when my babysitter actually took me to church. And so I got saved, but so don't take those Sunday school classes lightly. Those workers have a major impact. And I was one of them. But I did get saved at a young age, but I didn't get discipled. God had oases for me along the way, but I didn't really get time where someone really intentionally discipled me and taught me about the Bible and things like that. So I had a couple different things happen in my life. I'm from South Florida, Fort Lauderdale area, and oddly enough, I started playing ice hockey down there, which is kind of weird, but I worked at an ice rink.
That's awesome.
I thought it was those were the cool guys. They played hockey, so that was something I wanted to start doing. And I started doing that. I ended up going to Connecticut for a couple of years playing hockey up there. And then eventually realized it's cold up there. You got to start your car like 20 minutes early. And Florida, we don't have seasons. Yeah, everything's green all year round. So it's if you're going to stay and play hockey, I ended up going to Florida Atlantic University for a year, and I played there. And I was pretty lost, kind of tossed and turned by every wind of doctrine.
Sure.
Had questions on like postmodernism and things like that. I didn't understand that's what it was called, but ultimately that's what it was. But still remember the Sermon on the Mount. Still had that in my mind. And then one day, one of my friends was like, "Hey Ben, why don't you go to Liberty University?" And I'm like, "No, it's all right. I can start learning about God here in Florida. I don't have to go to Virginia to do that." And then I ended up talking to him about 2 weeks later. He's like, "Well, they got a hockey team with a rink on campus." And then I looked at the rink and I applied the next day. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, God used their rink to get me to go to Liberty. But then I found out at Liberty, people took questions about God, life, morality, meaning, all those sorts of questions seriously. And that probably not, probably didn't have the best circle of friends, but asking some of those questions, I wanted to ask them on deeper levels for a variety of reasons. But one of the things I remember learning when I went to Liberty, even as an undergrad, because I was a business undergrad, was Paul wrote half the New Testament. And I didn't know that. And I was like, oh my goodness, this like changes a lot for me on how I'm understanding what I'm reading. So then I started asking some questions. I met the former hockey coach. His name was Gary Habermas. And I was like, oh, that's neat. That's the old hockey coach. We're the new
That's
guys.
awesome.
We're a little bit, the new guys, when you're the playing team, you got to think you're the best team. So that's what we were doing. And then, I found out he's the resurrection expert. So I started asking him a couple questions. I ended up doing a master's degree in religious studies. And because I'm from South Florida, we've got a number of different worldviews. How do we discern between the different ones? What's the difference between them? What's the difference in what they teach, some of their scriptures, things like that. And then still had questions and was able to get a PhD. And in that time, I became Dr. Habermas's research assistant. And that was back before, for those of you who don't know who Dr. Habermas is, he's the world's leading expert on Jesus's resurrection. And over the past several years, we've been working on, and ultimately he has, I'm just the assistant here. So, but a 4-volume series on Jesus's resurrection. The first volume just came out in January, and it's 1,000 pages just on historical evidence and method. Yes, it's a incredible work. The second one is a little bit shorter. It's just on alternative theories. It's only about 950 pages, so just a little bit less.
That's funny.
And then there's 2 other volumes coming out after those 2. So that's been a great project to work on. We got along great because we're both, got the hockey background. Resurrection's just a great topic. But so that's kind of my background into apologetics. I had all those questions, and I started to find out you can get them answered, and you can. I don't think the truth is afraid of questions. Kind of was my approach, and so I enjoyed that, getting to do that. But then while at Liberty, one of the things I kind of realized was I know a lot of other people have these same questions too, and you shouldn't have to go get a master's degree or a graduate degree to know some of this stuff. Right. We also are working on keeping the work that Dr. Habermas has done. We want to help bring that to churches and organizations. So we're using apologetics to help bring that to different churches and organizations with core apologetics. So myself and another one of Habermas's students have started that. And a lot of the things we talk about there are apologetics, but also dealing with doubt. According to some Barna research, about 80% of Christians have unresolved questions, like I was having, and 50% for prolonged periods of time. So we need people who can help answer some of these questions, equip the next generation and the current generation to be able to address some of these, even just basic ones. And so we want to focus on, we're core apologetics, mere apologetics or mere Christianity is already kind of taken there. Right. But we're trying to focus and major on the majors is our goal there. And the other student, he also did his PhD at Liberty. He did it on doubt, and Habermas was one of his honorary readers. So we kind of joke between, this other gentleman, his name's Dr. Ron Davis, and myself. Maybe we can do half as much as what Habermas has done between the two of us. But we're a new ministry. We are doing this and trying to help other people in churches begin to equip believers so that we're getting questioned a lot more as it is. So all the more we need to be equipped. We need to be able to understand so that we can better stand when we're out in the culture and in the world and facing all of the challenges that life has.
Yeah, that's really good. I loved hearing your story because it's just so natural. And I think that so many people, well, it's natural and supernatural, right? At the same time, obviously you're going through different seasons of doubt, and the Lord really worked in your life and came to you at strategic points is what it sounds like. And a lot of people are in those same kind of situations and scenarios. And I think that's just amazing that just hearing your story puts it together. Like this is a story like many others. Obviously it's unique to you in a lot of ways, but there's those patterns that we can recognize between your story and our stories and the doubts that we all face. And I know that that's one of the reasons it seems like that you have written this new book, Trustworthy 13 Arguments for the Reliability of the New Testament. But I'd love for you to talk about why you wrote this book, this particular book, why you felt like it was such an important topic for our time right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, part of it came about because a lot of guys got used to seeing me around Dr. Habermas, and he got invited to speak somewhere, and they saw me and like, oh Ben, you come too. And so I was like, oh yes. And then I got home, I'm like, what am I going to talk about? Because everything I know, like he's taught me, I'm trying to think, okay, and it's resurrection. I don't want to talk on resurrection with him there. That's just seems odd. And so I was trying to think of something that'd be fruitful, that would be a good foundation that would have helped me. As I said, like when I came to Liberty, I had all these questions. And so as I started working through, like, oh, these are some of the, each of these different arguments are a different angle or layer, um, or perspective, which you can view the reliability and the trustworthiness of the New Testament. So I was like, all right, let's put those together. Um, it's like drinking through a fire hose. You're not going to get all 12 arguments or all 13, but you're going to get some of them. And God's equipped all of us differently. So, run with the ones that are interesting to you. And then the ones that aren't, leave those for guys who are interested in that. And that's kind of how the book came about. But I also try to make it, it's something of a, so I just kind of qualify it there, of a minimal facts argument for the reliability, because we're just highlighting these multiple different arguments, that I don't think they're too terribly, um, what's the word? There's not too much controversy on them. I think they're,
Mm.
we try to use some widely agreed upon data. Some areas may have a little bit more than others, but trying to stay in some, just some good foundations for someone who has questions about the New Testament, or if you're a believer just trying to get a handhold on, like, where do I begin with the New Testament? How do I start approaching that? And so that was one of the things. I was recently reminded too of the importance of this topic, with the Oklahoma and Louisiana, uh, recently, some of the decisions they've made regarding the Bible, and
Mm.
some people were. I'm typically on LinkedIn, which is kind of a weird place for apologists to be, but my old job, that's where I started, so that's kind of where I've been. But some people on there were criticizing them, and they're like, Constantine put the New Testament together, and I'm like, oh, brother, okay. The writings didn't exist. One guy said the writings didn't exist until 350 AD. And I was like, oh,
Wow.
okay. So this is actually an argument why the Bible needs to be taught in schools, because you guys are so like way out there, as far as just from a historical point of view. Because, it's, I don't think it's questioned the influence and impact of Christianity in the West, but understanding where we get that information is important, as well. So anyway, yeah, those are just some recent things that I was thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and I love the title of the book, Trustworthy, because I feel like what you're pointing out to there's a lot of myths that come up around the Bible that create this sense that it isn't trustworthy, or that you can't rely upon it, or that you can't, because like you can't even begin to take its message seriously in any way, because right off the bat, it's not trustworthy because of X. It was developed by some, emperor,
Mhm.
that Constantine, who just wanted to gain power, or some myth that didn't come around until 50 AD, which I never really heard that one before. That's a little bit of a new one to me. That's kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
in fairness to him, he admitted, he goes, I made a mistake. He did back off of it, but if no one would have said something, then that would have just gone right along, right
It
on,
just keeps on
without that.
going
And
along. So
so,
what inspired the title Trustworthy? Like what were you
oh,
trying to convey through that? Kind of talk a
I,
little bit about that.
I would love to take credit for it, but that was the publisher. Publisher came up with that title. I just told them, hey, here's the ethos, here's the feel of the book. I want to give these arguments in a real concise way to expose readers to this plethora of evidence. Because each chapter, I mean, there's books on every chapter. There's PhD
Absolutely.
dissertations on each of these topics. So when we're just doing, about 10 pages an argument, that's just there to give you an introduction, to give you kind of a baseline of where people are at. And so So that's what I was telling them, and they're like, okay. One of the things they said was, this is kind of a TikTok version of a book, and I was like, I guess that's one way to look at it. But they came up with the title, and I was very pleased with it. Afterwards, at first I was a little like, are you sure? I don't know. This is good, and they reassured me. So IVP, they did a good job with it. I was very pleased with that.
Yeah, that's so great. Who are the primary people that you're thinking these are the people that I want to pick up this book and I want
Mhm.
them to look at it? You kind of alluded before, but give us a little bit more insight. Who are you thinking about when you're thinking about the person reading this book?
Yeah, I'd say two key groups come to mind. Those maybe in high school going to college. I was a late I was a late goer to college. When I went to Liberty, I think I was 21 as a sophomore, but it was my fifth school, so it's got a whole story there. So
I'm sure it does.
right. So 15 to 25 year olds who are trying to understand the Bible and things like that. But also, one of the other groups are those who are serving in the churches. So if you've got a church and you've got a number of life group leaders, maybe a number of them aren't going to be able to go to seminary. And we probably don't want them going to seminary because we want them to be experts in whatever their field or discipline is. And so we want to equip them so that they can equip their small groups, their life group leaders. Now, a lot of those people are going to be business owners. So the reason why I think it's important for them, and this is another reason why I wanted to be brief and get to the point, but also highlight the key arguments that got us to that point, was uh, I believe this is a Barna study, but pastors will speak to, on average, like cumulatively rather, 8.8 million non-believers and nominal Christians. So that's pastors.
Wow.
Business owners, 110 million. So over 10 times. I believe it's actually 118 million,
Wow.
but over 10 times more. So we need to get those guys equipped because they're in the business world. They're talking with their employees, they're talking with suppliers, they're talking with all sorts of different people. So how do we equip them? So this was one way. And I also wanted to encourage people to read their Bible. That's another takeaway because we want to be engaging scripture because it's, as is often said, the Bible is something that not only we interpret, but it interprets us at the same time. So that was one of the things I was aiming for with the book as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love that because so much of this literature that's out there on these topics can really go over people's heads. I mean, they can be very complicated, it can be very complex. And of course, on the one hand, you don't want to make something not complicated if it is complicated, in the
Right.
sense that you want to match the complexity of wherever the subject is so as to not oversimplify, right? But
Exactly.
also, you don't want to make it so complex that people can't really understand it or not be able to wrap their heads around it.
Mhm.
And how did you kind of balance those two sides of the complexity of these issues that are in like textual criticism? That's an extremely complex
Yeah.
topic. It can
Yeah.
be, right?
Yeah.
And then on the other side, not wanting to oversimplify it, but also wanting to make sure that it's not so complex that people just don't understand it or their eyes glaze over when they're reading, especially in light of your target audience. Being kind of lay leaders is what I hear
Mhm.
you saying. I mean, pastors, for sure, people in ministry, but it's not necessarily written to scholars for scholars. It's written to people that would be interested in this subject, people that are reading the Bible, have an interest, lay people, they're making some kind of connection with others. So how did you strike that balance?
Well, I hope I struck it. I mean, the uh, first response. But I think part of it just has to do with as I was getting my degree and I was Habermas's research assistant, I had a full-time job as an insurance adjuster. So I had one foot in academia, one foot in the real world, as we say. So
Yes.
there is an ivory tower, or there can be an ivory tower when it comes to academics. And sometimes I start reading things, and I'm wondering, we're belaboring the point here on this possibility, like what's probable, and let's get to the key arguments here. So I think that was part of it. Another angle is, again, playing hockey. I also have a black belt in jiu-jitsu. So, we know really
Nice.
crazy jumping, flying, crazy moves. But if you don't know the fundamentals, you can't even get to those complex moves. So even in jiu-jitsu, it's the same thing. You can't show every move at a seminar or something like that, but you can, you got to start somewhere. So how do we start? How do we give the fundamentals, and we start breaking it down from there? Then after you study for a while, you can jump to the crazy stuff. But just making sure, keeping that connection with those in the real world. What kind of questions do they have? Because they don't always have the same luxury to spend time thinking on things the way academics do, because they've got a full-time job, they've got kids, they've got if they're serving at their church, and all sorts of other responsibilities. I understand guys in academia have that too, but there's a little bit difference when you're spending 8 hours a day studying a subject versus someone who may get 15 minutes, 20 minutes a week. Just two
Yes.
different things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're trying to take these complex things and bring them into, like, find the core part of these things, and like the core argument and the core data, and then present that as simply as possible. And I want to dig into some of the specific content that you have in the book, but I'd love for you to just, if you can, it's going to be a little bit of a test, to name the 13, and you can pull up the book if you want.
I'll probably have
or whatever, as many as whatever you need, but kind of name them and give a brief little synopsis of them, and then I want to dig into some of them.
Yes. One of the things I should have noted this, because that hockey player background, I understand that practice makes perfect. And so I had to do a lot of things repetitively and read and reread and reread it. So in the book, we list them out, then we go through them, and then we list them again, doing those summaries, because it's just, you got to hear them again. Now I did cheat. I kind of have it in front of me, but I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to see if I can do it without it. We start with textual criticism, because we have to understand, we can't tell if something has a reliable comments if we don't know that the comments themselves or what is written was actually what the original authors wrote. So we see that the New Testament has some of the best textual critical evidence for any writing in ancient history. And I cite the two leading New Testament textual critics in that regard: better than Plato, better than Homer. Then from there, we go to genre, would be the second argument, because we got to understand, were they trying to write historical accounts? Were they trying to write novels or romances? What were they trying to write? It's widely agreed upon today that the Gospels are ancient biographies. So that's a subcategory of history. So that's an important factor for how we interpret those. And then we've got Paul's writings, which are in-house letters to the church. So again, he's writing to people who already believe. So what goes on behind the scenes, so to speak. Third is either date or authorship, and I can't remember which one. I'm gonna
It's
cheat.
all right.
I'm gonna cheat here. Anyway, so we'll just go with date. We see that the New Testament, the writings are within the first century, so they're all within the
You're
lifetime.
correct. It was the dating.
I changed the order up, so I might have given you the wrong one from my initial presentation. But so yes, dating. We find that all the writings are within the first century, so within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, which is crucial, especially in light of them being biographies. So they're written within a time period people could verify these facts, they could test them. And not only are they written within the first century, but in the book I use Bart Ehrman's dating. He's a New Testament, probably one of the most popular New Testament agnostic atheist scholars. And I use the general dates that he gives for the Gospels and Paul's writings. And just for the Gospel writings, he puts Mark at about 65 AD, Matthew and Luke about 80, 85 AD, and then John about 95 AD. Paul's letters were written before Mark, so that dates even earlier. So again, even on taking an agnostic atheist's dates, we're within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. However, a new book has recently come out called Redating the New Testament, I believe it's called, by Jonathan Bernier. And he dates everything. So full book on the subject of dating. He dates everything to before 70 AD. So everything gets dated even earlier. And his is actually
That's remarkable.
yeah, and there's only been 2 full-length books on the dating of the New Testament writings, and both of them argue for early dates, and that's one of Bernie's points in his book. And so I put that little comment in there because he's like, if you guys think it dates later, write a full-length book on the subject. So go ahead.
There you go, dude.
Yeah.
Did he drop the mic after that? How do you drop a mic, scholarly speaking?
I just ended the chapter on his comment. Just take
That's
it.
good.
Appreciate it. There's your footnote. Thank you very much. But with the thing is that the takeaway for the reader, you don't have to worry about, is it pre-70? Is it just after 70? It's within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. There's people there who could check it. And so
that's great.
We've got good data. And again, there's a reason I went to marketing and not accounting. Okay. Not a math major, I'd like to joke with guys about that. We want to keep it simple. So, again, within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And then we talk about authorship. I give some reasons on why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the names that would be expected to be with the 4 Gospels. We give a couple good arguments between technically anonymous works and functionally anonymous works. I believe my book would be a technically anonymous work because I don't say this is Ben Shaw writing this book to you as an audience. I don't think I say that anywhere in the book, but there's a cover page which tells you that. Right. So it's not expected to be an anonymous book either. And there's a couple arguments as to why that happened in antiquity as well. All the references we have to these Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's no competitors. And so one of the things we highlight is, what are the odds of the different locations that have the different Gospels, if they were truly anonymous, that they'd all come up with the same name? That is a very, very big coincidence that, they're all going with Mark and Luke. By the way, neither of those 2 were disciples, but those were the 2 guys they wanted to take.
Especially in the ancient world where you don't have the kind of technology of communication like we do. It's very, very different for how those would be passed along.
Yes. And so those are some good reasons there regarding the Gospels. And then we talk about Paul, and there's undisputed Pauline works where even the most skeptical scholars grant a number of Pauline works attributed to him. So we can be confident there. I'm going to cheat for a minute now because once my mind gets going. I believe historical criteria should be the next one. And historical criteria is something very intuitive. We do it today. I did it as an insurance adjuster, like when I'm looking at accidents and trying to discern certain things. But basically, if we were to come up on a car accident, and this is an example I use in the book too, and we wanted to figure out what happened, we would want to find multiple witnesses. We'd want to see were there any biases to these witnesses. So, for example, there's a lot of sources in antiquity where there's just one source, but if we've got 2 sources saying it, that adds that adds great weight to that event having occurred. And so just a quick side note, Jesus's crucifixion, even skeptics grant about a dozen sources citing Jesus's crucifixion.
That's amazing.
Incredible weight for that event. So we do that today. I often joke and say, if Josh, you go and say you saw this car accident and then 400 people tweet that, okay, that's still only one source. Those retweets don't count. It's just one source. So we want multiple independent sources. So there's a little nuance there. But if my wife was in the car and she came and told you, yeah, it was my husband's fault. He did it. He just wasn't paying attention or whatever. That's embarrassing testimony because that goes against her interests. And so it's going to affect her. So that's another type of historical criteria. There's a gentleman named Kevin Burr. He did his whole dissertation on this subject. And it's something that we just do intuitively. And so we kind of try to break it down and give some bones, as it were, when it comes to dealing with antiquity, because it's a little different than now, because now we have multiple videos and cameras and all that kind of stuff. A little different back then. So we want to put those things into account. I also, I forgot, well, I don't remember if this comes before. I think this comes before New Testament creeds. This is something of a combination of the earlier arguments. And I use the analogy of Google Earth. So the first kind of arguments they start zoomed out and they kind of zoom in. New Testament creeds is a little more zoomed in. Historical criteria is a little more zoomed in. But New Testament creeds, they're not like the Nicene Creed or something like that, but they were early traditions that the church would have developed so that they could pass on information in a more memorable way. And scholars have found numerous creeds within the New Testament. And the most obvious one, and the one that's been most studied, is in 1 Corinthians 15. And the reason scholars know that is Paul says, I delivered to you that which I also received. And those delivered and received, that's technical language that would have been used for passing on tradition. So Paul says, hey, I delivered this to you when I was there, and I had also received it. And then he goes on to describe that Jesus died for our sins according to Scripture, that he was buried, that he raised 3 days later according to the Scripture, and that he appeared, and then he gives a bunch of appearances. So we have this information, and scholars, this isn't evangelical scholars, this isn't something idiosyncratic to us, this is the overwhelming majority of scholars. They date that creed and other similar creeds to the early 30s AD. And you go, well, how do they get that? That's pretty early, especially if Jesus died in 30 AD. How do they get to the early 30s? Well, in Galatians 1, which, by the way, 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians, they're both undisputably Pauline written letters. Undisputed. Even some of the greatest skeptics in the 19th centuries granted that as well. So, but in Galatians 1:18, Paul says 3 years after his conversion, he went to Jerusalem and met with Peter and James, the Lord's brother. So two, in the next chapter, he says, are pillars of the church. So he meets with them and he uses this Greek word hysteresis, and it has this word, this idea of getting firsthand acquaintance with, getting an interview, not an interrogation, but just getting firsthand experience. So he is talking to Peter. And so a lot of scholars date Paul getting his traditional material from Peter and James during this visit. If he didn't get it from them, maybe he got it in Damascus, they still confirm that material in Galatians 1 and then again in Galatians 2, because in Galatians 2, Paul says he goes back 14 years later and give him the right hand of fellowship. A lot there on creeds. Creeds is great. It's been really transformative for New Testament scholarship. Then we talk about undesigned coincidences. These are a little tricky, but they're really, they highlight a habit of the authors, because we know people who are habitually reliable and we know people who are habitually unreliable, and hopefully we're in the reliable camp. But what these undesigned coincidences do is it's like having two puzzle pieces made by two different people and they just fit together perfectly. And so I think it helps just to give an example of this. In John 6, when Jesus is feeding the 5,000, he asks Philip, hey, Philip, where do we get some food around here? Where's a place to get food? And you're like, well, that's interesting. Why does he ask Philip? He could have asked Peter. He could have asked John. He could have asked, anyone.
Yeah.
And we learn in John 1 that Philip is from Bethsaida. And you're like, okay, great. Glad he's from Bethsaida. What's your point? Well, so there's our puzzle piece. Philip's from Bethsaida. Jesus asks Philip where to get food for this miracle of the feeding of 5,000. In Luke, we learn the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in Bethsaida. So now it makes sense. Oh, he's asking the local guy, where do we go to get food here? And so that's a good example there. Now, there's also examples from Tacitus and Acts, for example. So there's in the New Testament, there's outside the New Testament where these pieces kind of align well. And so there's been some good evidence for those. Don't know if you had any questions.
No,
I had coffee earlier, so sure.
No, this is awesome. We got, I think, how many more? Because I'll ask you specific ones about these. If you want to jump into that, that's totally cool.
We got five more. Well, technically 6 more. Archaeology, there's been a number of archaeological discoveries that have confirmed and reaffirmed what we know in the New Testament as far as consistency, because it's tough. Archaeology has some limitations because it can't tell you what someone said unless it's an inscription of what someone said. So an ossuary or something like that. But we do find, for example, the 5 porticos mentioned in John. That's been discovered and confirmed, that description, which for a number of years, people questioned its accuracy and whether it existed. We
Of
see a
course.
number of non-Christian sources that attest to things that we find in the New Testament. And I'll just for a moment, many of your listeners are probably familiar with Josephus and Tacitus. And so I don't know if all the readers of my book would be familiar with them, so I present them. But one of the interesting things to note is Tacitus and Josephus, they refer to Jesus' crucifixion, but they don't say things like it happened in Greece or it happened in Egypt. They affirm like there's a consistency here with what they're reporting. They don't suggest something beyond what the New Testament says. So we're seeing this additional corroboration. We see it with non-canonical Christian texts. So Christian texts outside of the New Testament. And one of those is Clement of Rome. He was writing about 95 AD. So another early Christian writer, considered to be a valuable resource to read. Historically, he's a good source as well. And but he gives us information about the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, for example. So we've got first century source for those for their martyrdoms. And then we talk about the development of the canon, the New Testament canon itself. And hopefully by now we're at a point where we could go, if I were to ask you, if Josh were making the New Testament canon today, what would be some of the sources you look for? And hopefully you're going to go, well, I want ones that would be written by the apostles or those associated with the apostles. So we kind of saw that's what we had already. They were writing during the time of the apostles, because I don't want something that says, is from Thomas, but then it's written in the second century. So I want something at the time, but also want writings too that were widely accepted by the church. And so we start to see that those were some of the things that we have in the New Testament itself. Clement of Rome, a good writing, but it was kind of localized to the church in Corinth. So it didn't have that same authority that the other New Testament writings did. So we talk about that a little bit as well. And then the next to last argument is a spiritual transformation one. And this is not so much it doesn't confer reliability on the New Testament, but it is consistent with the New Testament. And there's a subtle but important distinction there, because there's a bunch of books that have made an impact in the world or have transformed lives. Yeah. But if the New Testament is true, and Jesus is who he says he is and did what he said he did, and the Holy Spirit is active in doing things in the world, then we should expect these things to happen. It would be weird for the New Testament to be true and us not to see the world changed and transformed. So I highlight that both directly in personal experiences of individuals, but also indirect attestation from skeptics who recognize the value and benefit that Christianity has had on the lives of others. And so, Dawkins may be an example of that. He made that I'm a cultural Christian comment recently. So that may be a sort of example there. We give a couple others. And then the very last argument, and I don't say this in the book, but this is the subtext if you read them between the lines. If the first 12 arguments I just gave are all horrible and they're all bad, they don't work, we have the 13th argument, which is the minimal facts argument.
Yes, please.
That argument, yes, it sustains the gospel of Jesus's death and resurrection using only data that is highly evidenced and widely agreed upon by scholars of all backgrounds. And so that's Habermas's book in 1,054 pages. If you want to dig into the black belt level on that, there's another good book called The Case for the Resurrection, which is one of the best books on the subject as far as it's a great introductory book, but it also covers a lot of depth at the same time. So that's the overview.
Dude, that was awesome. I love that. So I got to ask, as you're talking, I'm like, man, there are so many people I'm going to want to share this. I mean, we share these episodes anyway, but that was such a great, within 10 minutes, a succinct kind of definition of something that could whet people's appetites to think about, hey, wait, there are reasons to believe in the reliability of the New Testament, right? The Old Testament is a different beast. It's a different animal. You have to go to different places, and that's fine. Maybe your next book is on the reliability of the Old Testament. But on this one, looking at that, it's fascinating to hear that. And I gotta ask, as you're putting these arguments together, right? You have certain arguments that are reliant upon other arguments, like series arguments, where something happens that creates this, that causes this, that causes this. And if you take anything out of the chain, then the argument is gone. And then you have, right, the multiple arguments, which are the independent arguments that each on their own kind of
Mhm.
like affirm, or you can make an inference, or by implication, each argument would come to this claim: the New Testament is reliability. And then you have these kind of convergent arguments where they kind of converge together to create a cumulative case. How do you feel like these arguments are? Are they all independent? Are some of them reliant upon each other? Do they converge within this? Like, how would you kind of look at these arguments and not rank them, so to
Mhm.
speak, but kind of see, like, are they essentially 13 independent arguments
Mhm.
that each could help someone come to a place of, yeah, the New Testament's reliable?
Yeah, I think they are largely, there is some interconnection between them. For example, the historical criteria is kind of like, it's kind of everywhere, because we use these criteria because you want sources that are early. So that kind of ties into the
Yes.
dating argument. Um, we want eyewitness sources. That kind of ties into the creeds and authorship uh, elements. So the criteria kind of permeates. So there's some overlap there with them. But at the same time, they argue at different levels. So when we're talking about criteria, they will often argue for more specific events. So using that Google Earth imagery, um, it's more like being on a street view. And okay, we're looking at this specific event, Jesus' death on the crucifixion.
Mm.
There's a lot of individual historical criteria that are met here, and each of them adds, a rock on the scale, adding weight to it. Now, genre, for example, that's a broad overview. You're just trying to make sure, okay, am I in the right ballpark here? Am I in the right stadium with what I'm trying to interpret? How do I understand this writing? Are they trying to say something historical that happened in space time, or are they just telling a nice story? And so those are things where they're going to be independent of one another. The dating is, but dating and authorship can tie in as well. So um, they're not a string, as you were saying. If you take one away, or a house of cards or something to that effect. Um, but there is some independence but overlap. So maybe some
Yeah,
convergence. I like the way you put that.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Which one of these arguments was the most like insightful for you? Like the one that you were the most excited, like you hadn't necessarily heard it before, and then it came to you, and you felt like a different kind of energy behind it, if there is one.
Yeah, well, I probably like historical criteria. That's one of my favorites. I like the minimal facts. That kind of doesn't count. I don't count that one because I did my dissertation and theses on that subject. So that's my ultimate favorite. But we use historical criteria in there as well. But I like genre. I was really genre is really interesting to me. One of the big things that has stuck with me was the fact that they used biographies to describe Jesus, or to write about Jesus, rather.
Hmm.
Uh, the study that came out of that was Richard Burridge's What Are the Gospels? That's considered to be the definitive work on the subject. That's convinced an overwhelming majority of scholars that the Gospels are biographies. But Burridge, when he wrote that's his dissertation. That book was his dissertation, and he initially argued against the Gospels being biographies. So he was convinced through the reading of that the Gospels are biographies. And so that adds great strength to how we understand the New Testament. But also, he points out, how many biographies do we have of early rabbis? We don't have any. Why did they write biographies about Jesus? Why did they think
Hmm.
Jesus' life was one worth emulating and following? Especially if we're believing that God is one, we should not have any idols, because when rabbis were speaking, they were written about to the extent to which they told others to follow the law. But when we're seeing a life about Jesus,
Hmm.
we're supposed to follow him, because in following him, we are following God and being faithful to God. So I was like, whoa, that's a profound and unique argument that I had not heard of for very high Christology, and an understanding of saying Jesus is worthy of worship without actually saying it, just by their actions, by the nature of the genre they wrote. So I thought that was one of the interesting ones for me.
That's fascinating. I love that. This idea that, yeah, I mean, he was so important to them that they had to write not only just one, but multiple gospels, multiple biographies that all carry their own kind of weight when it comes to understanding Jesus. Like
Yeah.
you said, all written in the first century, all like very much dependent on eyewitness testimony, things like that. It's just fascinating even putting that together. I absolutely love that. What about these historical criteria? Kind of dig into that a little bit. Like, what are the historical criteria? Why is it significant? Kind of like, how do historical criteria help us even to start understanding the dating and reliability of events
Right.
within
Yep.
like that are that far that long ago?
So because we use historical criteria today for everyday events, whether they happen, an hour ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, it's still the same because we still have the same access to the past. It's not like because, you know, we're in the present time, we've got special access to the past or anything like that. So we all have the same access to the past. And we tend to do these whether intuitively or consciously because the Bible's been scrutinized more than any other book. We have these criteria that have really been nailed down. They use the same criteria in classical literature as well for like Greco-Roman history, uh, but they just call it by different names. That's Kevin Burr's book. He talks about that too. But when you have things like, for example, Jesus's crucifixion, the fact that the earliest believers went around and said, "Your Lord has been crucified, and you need to follow him." That was incredibly offensive and embarrassing to the wider culture. It didn't matter if you were Jewish or Gentile. Paul says preaching the cross was foolishness to the Gentiles and a stumbling block to the Jews, because the Jews, according to Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, thought anyone hung was cursed by God. So you're like, you're telling me this cursed guy is our long-awaited Messiah? This is what you're trying to tell me? So that's highly embarrassing. And yet that is something they did. So we see this embarrassing component. We also see the multiple attestation component. We see it's also attested to in the earliest material we have. It's in that creed that I mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, but it's referenced in throughout the New Testament. Non-Christian sources refer to it. Non-canonical Christian sources also reference it. So it's referenced all over the place. And so each of those add weight to the historical probability of its occurrence. And so historical criteria, typically, they only add weight to an event. So the more criteria you have met, the more weight it adds. If I don't have a criteria, it's not like it counts against it. We just have less weight to believe it. The only exception to that may be consistency. So for example, if, we read an account, the disciples were riding motorcycles. We're like, okay, well, that's not consistent with the time period. So because it's not matching the consistency, that's a mark against it. So that would be an example there. That's just a black and white, easy example to see the difference. So I think that's a good one. Another example, you could think about James's disbelief during his lifetime. They could have left that out of the Gospels. I mean, John's explicit. Even his brothers weren't believing him. Peter's called Satan at one point. Like these are two leaders of the early church. They could have left that out, but they kept it in there. The women being the earliest witnesses to the empty tomb. There's all sorts of embarrassing testimony throughout the New Testament. So those are things. We also see enemy attestation, for example, with the Jewish authorities saying the disciples stole the body. We see Josephus and Tacitus, their comments too about Christianity. So we take all these together and they're just adding weight to the historical probability. Now, I just want to make this one part clear. It's not like some mathematical formula where we just plug things in and punch them in and get them out. We still have to do some weighing and assessing and take other things into account. But that is an important element, and we want to have that accounted for in our discussion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about this idea? I would love to hear, especially because you have done so much work on this. I would love for you to sketch out, even in a little bit more detail, the idea of the minimal facts argument.
Oh, yeah.
So you talk about that one. If you don't believe any of the other ones, this has enough weight on its own to make that inference between the data there and the claim that the New Testament is reliable. What Go into more detail there. I'd love for you to explain that more to us.
Yeah. The minimal facts are great, and this was probably this was probably the reason why I liked them so much, because I was a hockey guy going into school and starting to learn about these things, and it was simple enough for me to understand it. And you can start with, say, 5 or 6 facts that are just widely agreed upon. They're not facts because they're widely agreed upon. They're facts because they're highly evidenced. And so remember, those were the 2 criteria. And the criterion that they are highly evidenced is the most important of those 2. But there's a number of them. And so depending upon who you're talking with, you could use more or less, just depending on how skeptical they are. But it's a common ground approach. This way, we're not having to discuss, and maybe someone wants to go into an hour on discussing authorship, or an hour in discussing whatever different topic. We can just, maybe they want to discuss an hour on contradictions. Maybe they want to talk, and you go, okay, for the sake of the argument, I'm going to grant there's contradictions. As a matter of fact, if you think and Habermas has done this in presentations, so I'm stealing it from him, but it's good, so I'm going to steal it. If you think the Bible is inerrant and inspired, you're going to get a resurrection. If you think it's errant but generally reliable, you're going to get a resurrection. And if you think it's full of errors and generally unreliable, you're still going to get a resurrection. And you're like, well, wait a minute, how's this? This doesn't seem fair. How's this work? Well, we have these highly evidenced facts, and we start discussing how they're highly evidenced. So sometimes people will misunderstand the argument, and they'll say, well, you're using the Bible. You can't do that. I thought you said, we think it's unreliable. Well, yeah, just because you think a source is unreliable doesn't mean you can't use it as a historical source. Nobody thinks Tacitus or Josephus is infallible. No one thinks that they're inerrant, but they still use them as sources. And so if we don't use them as sources, skeptics will. So we want to make sure we're using them, but we're going to use them as even skeptics would use them. So we can assume, for the sake of the argument, that there are contradictions. So I'm not even going to bother discussing that. I want to talk about what we do know based on historical evidence and argumentation and all those sorts of things. And again, these aren't idiosyncratic conservative evangelical beliefs, but these are widely accepted. And just a quick side note on that widely accepted part, there is a book by David Mishkin. I believe his first name's David, but he does this all with Jewish scholars, and he goes through and just isolates Jewish scholars. What do they think on these different facts we're about to talk about? But the first is that Jesus died on the cross. So again, we mentioned before 12 arguments or 12 sources attesting to Jesus' death on the cross. We talked about it being embarrassing and being early. Virtually everyone today agrees that Jesus died on the cross. And there's other reasons too. The Strauss critique, the famous Strauss critique. David Strauss was a 19th century German liberal by his own standing, skeptic of Christianity, but he's put forward the Strauss critique. But we don't need to get into that here, but that's considered to have put the nail into the coffin of the idea Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. That the disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus is another one. It's attested to in a number of sources. It's attested to early. So again, there's a number of different arguments we have for that, because we have to remember the New Testament, it's not just one source. There's 27 different books and letters in there. Now, some of them are by the same author, Paul, but we still have different sources in there, and we want to treat them like different sources. So disciples' experiences, that they are reported early. I mentioned that creed in 1 Corinthians 15. That's the earliest evidence we have for the resurrection. That the disciples were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs. So, and we have some nuance there, because we don't want to say that all the disciples suffered and died for their belief. They didn't all die as martyrs. We know John, for example. But they were willing to, and they were willing to suffer and die. So we see that. And we mentioned before, we have first century evidence for Peter and Paul's martyrdom. Josephus references James, Jesus' brother's martyrdom. In Acts 12, we've got another martyrdom of James. And so we have good evidence. Paul and First Peter, for example, they reference suffering and Christians willing to be suffering and those sorts of things. Acts, again. So we see that. That's 4. 5 is going to be the conversion of James, who was a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, as we mentioned before. That too is multiply evidenced. Mark and John both report that. So it's multiply evidenced. It's in the earliest gospel, which would be Mark, according to most scholars. It's highly embarrassing. And yet he becomes the leader in the early church. And one scholar famously said, if we didn't have an appearance reported about James, which, by the way, that's from Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And if you remember, Paul met with Peter and James in Galatians 1. So interesting there that he's noted. But he says if we didn't have an appearance to James, we'd have to invent one to account why he was the leader in the early church. And then we've got the conversion of Paul. So a lot of these facts are ones that we're all pretty familiar with. Maybe the conversion of James is something we don't quite talk about as much. It's overshadowed by Paul's conversion. But those are 6 well-evidenced facts. Those are 6 that are talked about in great detail in Habermas's large 1,000-plus page volume. He actually does another 6 on top of that. But when you have those 6 facts, it makes alternative theories. This is what is really interesting. It makes alternative theories very difficult to explain those 6 facts consistently. And that's part of the challenge there. So when you look at things like the disciples stealing the body, okay, well, if we just look at these 6 facts, which ones do they not account for? Well, okay, let's just start here. Paul probably thought the disciples stole the body. Why would he convert? If the body was stolen, he's not having an experience of the risen Jesus, and neither is James, who is also a skeptic. I should say James was a skeptic. Paul was a persecutor of the church. I'm downgrading Paul here. So those are significant factors. And then also the disciples were willing to suffer and die. If they stole Jesus's body, their willingness to suffer and die is going to be highly problematic. There's 2 good sayings: martyrs make poor myth makers, and liars make poor martyrs. So those are
awesome.
And that's just using those 6 facts. We're not. You can go beyond that because you need to have some historical evidence that the disciples did in fact steal the body, not just speculate that they did. But we need to have some positive evidence to suggest that that was the case. So we see in there. We also have group appearances of Jesus. If the disciples stole the body, I don't think they're. I don't want to say. I'm trying to think of a nice way to put it, but. Having him appeared to the 12, to the disciples, and to more than 500, for example, those are the 3 group appearances mentioned in the earliest evidence we have. That's going to get more tricky to explain. So anyway, that's just an example there. That Case for the Resurrection book by Habermas and Makona, one of the best on the subject. They get in all sorts of different alternative theories, aliens, all sorts of stuff. It's really good.
Nice.
Read. Yeah, they go into it, and so that's the great one. Or you can just get Habermas's 900 pages on it when it comes out in a couple months.
That's awesome. Well, that's been such an awesome interview. I could keep talking, but I just have 2 more questions. One's a practical one, and the other one is a little bit more of a philosophical one for you. If I don't even know if that's the right term, but the last kind of question about the content in the actual book is, what are you hoping that it accomplishes? Like, what kind of stories would you want to hear that would then serve as evidence for you that this book has accomplished what you set out for it to do its purpose when you wrote?
That's a great question. I had not thought about it until you just asked it. I was initially writing it because I had those questions. I thought it was pleasing to the Lord to write this as well.
Absolutely.
Because you go through times when you're writing it, and you have this thought more than once: who's going to care about this? Who's going to want to read this? This is like, you're just wasting your time here, and you got to like fight through those things.
Right.
And but my hope is, to the front, it's made to disciples and doubters, and sometimes those are the same. They're in the same category.
Yes.
So it's to encourage disciples to better understand. If Scripture is going to be our authority, we want to understand it. So we should be asking those questions. That helps us understand it and appreciate it better. And so now when we're reading it, we can get a better understanding of what it says, and then how to apply what it says to our lives, and also see if we're in alignment with that as well. So that's one element. Those who have questions may have clarity, or their doubt may get some of their questions resolved so that they can go and be fruitful, because doubt and periods of questioning can just keep you from being fruitful in activity. So hopefully that will be part of it. And if skeptics read it and they're like, oh, This does put some stones in my shoe, as Coco says. That's good because we want them to get some of this information so that they can better understand why believers believe what they do. And then the last thing I would say is it's primarily for believers, going back to disciples, but if Lord willing, if another edition comes out, I'd like to do an appendix with, okay, now how do you read your Bible? How do you apply this? Like, okay, now I understand. How do I start engaging Scripture? As part of Core Apologetics on our website, at the moment, we have a free journal people can download to help them get started reading Scripture and engaging it daily. Because there's all sorts of studies about the difference just reading 4 times a week can have in your life. Exponentially more likely to encourage other believers, exponentially more likely to memorize Scripture, exponentially more likely to keep your eyes on things that they should be on, all sorts of different things. So we want to encourage believers to do that. When I went to Liberty, I had tried to read my Bible so many times, started at Genesis, stopped at like Leviticus. Maybe the next time, I went a little further, but just struggled. And one gentleman was like, it was at a football game, because I was asking, the hockey guys were hanging out, watching a football game. And one guy was like, well, if you just read 3 chapters a day, you'll read the New Testament about 4 times in a year. And I was like, oh, I can do that. 3? That's easy. Even if I don't get what I read today, well, tomorrow's a new day. I can get back on it tomorrow. And so I started doing that. And if you read Proverbs 1 chapter a day, you'll have that 12 times in a year. And I was like, okay, these are good handholds for me to begin. Because I don't know what I'm doing or where I'm going. So this is a good place for me to start. Other studies I've seen, just 2 chapters a day, you'll get almost 3 through the New Testament almost 3 times in a year. If you read about 20 minutes a day, you can do all the Gospels and Acts in a month. And so I just say, if you think about that, if you did those sorts of things, you would look a lot different a year from now. And so that would be one of the things I would like to hear that people are doing. Just engaging Scripture and being better disciples, loving others, bearing fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, all those sorts of things, seeing that lived out.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that answer. And I agree that it would be amazing if people would start to pick up their Bibles. What would happen? So how can people get the book, and how can they connect with you about future projects and more work that you're doing?
Well, I'd say the book is at Amazon, ChristianBooks.com, all the major websites. It's out on July 30th is its official launch date. And it's about 150 pages or so, a little bit shorter. So that's the book. If you're interested in getting a quote unquote free copy, I'll put it like that. Our ministry, Core Apologetics, we as a new ministry, we're trying to raise support right now. We're doing fundraising. We're at about 30% of our goal. And so we're trying to get 100 core project partners. And so there's different levels that people can partner with us at, and we give a free copy of a book away. We have some online classes that we try to do. That was something else that, again, when I was mentioning, you shouldn't have to go to get a master's degree just to get discipled. So we're doing online classes as well, which has been great because they're live. They're taught live. It's not modules or anything like that. And so that way we're getting engagement with one another. We've had people from Japan on the classes already, which has been great, all across the world, just really exciting. But our website is www.coreapologetics.com. We're on the traditional social media sites, and I mentioned I'm on LinkedIn. I'm just now on Facebook, getting back on there. Ron, he's the founder of Core. He twisted my arm. He's like, Ben, you gotta come back there. So I'm back on there to a limited degree. But yeah, coreapologetics.com, and then there's a bunch of ways you can see what we're doing, and also reach out to us if you have any questions or anything like that.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Ben. It was a real pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me, and I'm just glad I was able to share a little bit about what we're doing, and appreciate you giving us that chance.
Absolutely. Well, to our listeners and watchers, thanks for joining us. This has been Dr. Ben Shaw. Make sure you check out work. We'll put links to it in the description of the show. And until we see you guys next time, God bless and take care.